And now, NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen with your host, Susie Ross.
Hello, I'm Susie Ross. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen. This week, we're taking a look at a viewer favorite, Cattlemen and Cowboys. The feature is narrated by the legendary John Wayne. Let's take a look.
Cattlemen and Cowboys. They played a big role in our history, all 200 years of it. And they're still playing a big part of America today. Maybe the facts get a little mixed up with the tall stories sometimes. But even today, just about any young kid can tell you stories about cowboys, their tough lives, and how great it must have been to live in those days. A lot of people think time has stood still for the cattlemen. They think the cowboy's life is about the same now as it was 100 years ago. Movies, television, and books have prolonged that image. And the cattlemen themselves have done their part in keeping it alive. Why do we do it? Maybe it's nostalgia for the good old days. It's not a bad legend. It's harmless and exciting. When you think about it, it might even do some good for our crumbling moral standards. In the myth, the bad guys never win. In real life, they seem to win all too often. As a tribute to cattlemen and cowboys, this short history is going to look at real life, throw out the myths. We're going to look at the old and the new. We're going to look at those people who raise beef for a living and see what makes them keep on doing it. The first cattle, at least the first English cattle, arrived in this country in 1624, 4 years after the Mayflower. It was a big event in the Plymouth colony. Governor Bradford declared that those 3 scraggly heifers and 1 bull to be the beginning of cattle in this land. He wasn't completely right. Spain introduced cattle in Mexico in 1525, and the Spanish settlers brought cattle with them into the western part of the United States from 1540 through 1580. The Dutch were already establishing themselves as cattle raisers in 1614 with Flemish-type bulls and cows in New York. Most people don't know that the first so-called range war was fought on Manhattan Island. The Dutch had a running battle with the Indians to keep them from stealing their cattle. They finally built a wall to keep the Indians out and the cattle in. You can stand on the side of that wall in New York City today. It's called Wall Street. Around 1699, the French made their contribution, too. That's when the French cattle were introduced into Biloxi. These were just the beginnings. As the country's population grew, so did the need for more cattle to provide beef and milk and leather and brute force for the plow. As the eastern frontiers continued to push west, the great cattle movement from the far west was just getting started. The Longhorn helped to bring it all about. These tough animals were descendants of the cattle brought by the Spaniards. The The Spanish missions brought the Longhorns into Texas, New Mexico, and California. Padres taught the Indians how to herd, pasture, and breed the animals. It's sort of ironic that the Indians became some of the very first cowboys. They called them vaqueros, and they were fantastic horsemen, every one of them. To teach them, the Padres decided they'd just ignore the old Spanish law forbidding Indians to use horses. Texas broke away from Mexico in 1836 and was annexed by the United States 9 years later. Would-be ranchers started to pour into the Lone Star State from all directions. They were a mixed lot, those newcomers. Some were disappointed miners. Some had come west to fight Indians, some for their health, some to hunt for the fast-disappearing buffalo. Very few had ever raised cattle before. Some had never even seen a cow. But the heavy publicity and the glowing reports out of Texas encouraged them to come to make their fortunes. By 1860, the Texas herds had grown to 3.5 million head. But then came the Civil War. With no one to tend them for 5 years, cattle all over the South grew wild on the open range. By war's end, the longhorn population in Texas alone had swollen to 5 million head, most of them wandering through the brush country, and most of them up for grabs. It didn't take much money to get into the business in those days. What you needed was a good pony, saddle, rope, branding iron, and a sharp knife. When a calf was a year old, custom said, the first man who put a rope on him was the owner. Now, not just in Texas, but all over the South, cattle roamed with no owners to claim them. In Oklahoma, they were as wild as deer and twice as dangerous. Some lived to be 15 or 20 years old. Males weighed from 1,200 pounds up and had horns that measured 6 feet from tip to tip. In those times, there were 3 unbranded calves for every branded one. The unbranded animals were called Mavericks after a fellow named Sam Maverick. Maverick went out of business in less than a year because he didn't believe in branding. The problem was his neighbors did believe in it, and they used their own branding irons much of the time on Sam Maverick steers.
Patience may be a virtue, but when cattle are down with shipping fever, you don't have time to be patient. And that's why Baytril 100 was designed specifically for first-line treatment of bovine respiratory disease. For use by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian. Extra label use in food-producing animals is prohibited. Ask your veterinarian for more information. When it's BRD, patience isn't an option. Choose Baytril 100, right the first time.
2 100% pure USDA inspected patties are only the beginning of what make the Big Mac famous, and that's what we're made of.
Fort Dodge Animal Health knows your animals are an important part of your way of life. That's why we're committed to providing you with a complete family of livestock vaccines and pharmaceuticals to protect your investments, save you time, and ensure quality and safety in your operation. Your herd and your horses are important to you. That's why they're important to us. Fort Dodge Animal Health. For more information on our entire family of livestock products, visit us online.
NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen, a television show by cattlemen for cattlemen.
Fortunes were made and lost in the flicker of an eye in those days. Colorful characters with their eyes fixed on profit and loss statements set up huge empires. These were the cattle barons, men like Charlie Goodnight. He started as a tough young cowboy busting horses in Brazos County and died ruling 20 million acres of Texas range. Goodnight worked hard, stole a few cattle on occasions, and lynched rustlers who stole his. Then there were men like Conrad Coors in Montana, a former butcher who replaced stringy longhorns with the first Herefords in that state. Coors was a pauper or a millionaire, depending on which point in his life you looked at. There were men like Alexander Swan, who built the Swan Land and Cattle Company with money provided by Scottish investors. When they found his herd count short by 32,000 head in 1889, Swan's empire collapsed. But until then, he was riding high. Swan staged Wyoming's first rodeo for his company's owners in the 1880s. One of his cowboys, Robert Leroy Parker, fascinated the foreign visitors with his fancy roping and pistol shooting. Now, Parker later made a name for himself in another field of work, along with his friend Harry Longbow. They don't look much like Newman and Redford, do they? Well, anyway, they became very big in the railroad and bank business. There were plenty of other cattle barons, of course. John Wesley Iliff in Colorado, Granville Stewart in Dakota and Montana, and the celebrated King Ranch, and the fabulous XIT. Each and every one is a story by itself. In its heyday, foreign investors and shrewd Easterners like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt poured money into the cattle industry. But to make money for cattlemen and investors, the cattle had to reach the big markets in the north and the east. Ranchers had to look to the tough, single-minded cowboy to get them there. Probably no folk hero in history ever acted out his role better than the overworked, underfed man on horseback. His daily life was just about as hard as legend tells it, maybe even harder. He had to cover himself from head to foot in armor just to get through a day. Every item the cowboy wore had a special purpose, from the broad-brimmed hat that kept the sun and rain off his head right down to the spurs on the back of his boots. Even the fancy-looking bandana had functions, as a mask to keep out trail dust, as insulation against the sun, or a tourniquet in case of snake bite. He usually wore long johns, unless it was too hot. His shirt was made of cotton or flannel. His pants sometimes had buckskin sewn over the seat and thighs where they rubbed against the saddle. And he usually wore a vest because it was hard to get at anything in his pants pockets while riding. Along with his saddle and boots, the hat was the cowboy's proudest possession. Besides warding off everything from hailstones to sharp branches, he used it to fan a fire or get a drink of water. Old-time etiquette let the cowboy wear his hat just about anywhere. Sometimes he even wore it to bed. Contrary to the myth, the horse wasn't necessarily the cowboy's best friend. He saw his pony as a tool that added to his own muscle, power, and mobility. Few cowboys actually owned their own horse. Mounts were supplied by the ranch they worked for. If a man did happen to own his own horse, he put it in the ranch's common pool as a sign of his commitment to the rancher. The cowboy always treated the animal for what it was, a useful tool. He fed it and cared for it with that purpose in mind. He might not have loved the animal, but he had respect for it. Another indispensable tool was the rope. Thrown by an expert, a rope enabled a 150-pound man to throw a 1,000-pound animal. It was used as a hobble to keep horses from straying. Wrapped around a saddle horn, cowboys used it to drag firewood or pull a steer out of the mud. And rarely, very rarely in the old days, it could be shaped into a hangman's noose for some short-order justice.
NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen, a television show by cattlemen for cattlemen.
Purina's wind and rain minerals are research tested and field proven to provide balanced mineral nutrition essential for cattle health, growth, and reproduction. They're highly palatable so cattle consume what they need when they need it. And wind and rain minerals special formulation resists the elements so they won't blow out of the feeder and maintain their palatability even if they've been wet. Wind and rain cattle minerals from Purina Mills, building better cattle.
Our quarter pounder with cheese is made from 100% pure USDA beef. That means there's 0% anything else. That's what we're made of.
People have different views of what they think's attractive. And while a SelectVac tag doesn't do anything for this dog, it certainly makes calves more attractive to buyers. In fact, SelectVac calves attract up to $29 more per head. No wonder millions of calves have already been enrolled. Ask your veterinarian or animal health supplier about SelectVac, the premier branded preconditioning program, and raise more attractive calves.
NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen, a television show by cattlemen for cattlemen.
The cowboy prized his gun, too. But he didn't use it on people as often as he does in legend. A lot of the big ranchers wouldn't even let him carry it with him. The XIT ranch in Texas posted firm rules about weapons. No cowboy could carry a pistol, a dirk, a dagger, slingshot, brass knuckles, or a bowie knife. Must have been the first attempt at gun control, but at least they covered anything that could maim you. The reasons were obvious. Ranchers didn't want their hands firing guns and spooking the cattle. But that didn't prevent cowboys from taking their guns when they went to town, and particularly on the long trail drives. That's where they were needed. That was where the cowboy really proved himself, on the trail drive. The high time of the big cattle drives only lasted from the end of the Civil War until the mid-1880s. But in that short 20 years, 10 million cows walked to the railheads in Kansas and Missouri. The trail drive was hell on the cowboys and the steers. They drowned in sinkholes at river crossings. Jayhawkers and Indians either stole cows or demanded 10 cents a head to let them pass. Farmers drove the herds out of their fields with guns. And then there was the weather. Lightning and thunder set off stampedes. Some folks said that when lightning struck, cowboys had scrambled to bury their metal spurs in the ground. Anyway, there was never enough water for the cattle or enough sleep for the cowboy. When they finally reached the cattle towns and were paid their $100, the cowboys set to spending it as fast as they could. Sometimes they ran into tough marshals, so-called town tamers, who kept the cowboys celebrating under control. Men like Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene or Wyatt Earp in Dodge City. Nobody minded if the cowboy spent all his money. They just wanted to take it from him with the least amount of ruckus. Hickok, Masterson, Earp, and men of their ilk made sure this was the case. Even before the big trail drives, the frontiers were being pushed back from the east through Illinois, the Ohio River Basin, Indiana, and Iowa. Zebulon Pike spread the word that raising stock in the new land was a prosperous business, and people listened. The great Northwest areas opened up to cattle, and some great herds were bred there. New and improved breeds that had been around for years started to flourish, beginning with the Shorthorns in Virginia and followed by the Herefords brought into Kentucky by Henry Clay and the Angus introduced by George Grant in Kansas. Development of the polled Hereford in Iowa gave cattlemen still another breed choice, as did the creation of the Big Red at the King Ranch in Texas, the Santa Gertrudis, and much later the appearance of the so-called exotic breeds. Before the turn of the century, cattlemen could read the writing on the wall. The need had developed for some kind of a national cattlemen's organization. That need was filled at a meeting in Denver in 1898. The name of the outfit has changed through the years. Today it's known as the American National Cattlemen's Association. The creation of that national organization back in 1898 was out of necessity, not out of any need for social gatherings. Cattlemen needed some kind of a national unity. The country was changing, and their business was changing along with it. They had to adjust if they wanted to survive. Barbed wire had put an end to open range and free grass, and it finished off the old methods of handling stock. The long cattle drives were over. And hard on the heels of the barbed wire salesman was the man with the plow. With the farmer came the development of irrigation, and along with that, mechanization. The cattleman had to change or get lost in the shuffle, and he did change. Just like the other breeds replaced the longhorns, a new breed of cattleman emerged too. He's now 1,000 times better equipped for his job. He uses modern methods. He uses modern means of transportation because he has to travel more and more often and much greater distances. He produces more and better beef than ever before. What about that beef? Where are the cattle located now? You name it. They're in virtually every state, north, south, east, and west. From Maryland to Hawaii, from Minnesota to Florida. Modern cattle and modern cattlemen with strong state cattlemen's organizations backing them up. Cattle feedlots grew in the name of efficiency. Today, in 23 states alone, you'll find close to 150,000 feedlots. These technical marvels play a big part in helping to feed a hungry America. By using scientifically balanced diets, today's feeders can turn animals into 1,000-pound finished steers in less than 5 months. It's only been since the 1950s that cattle feeders have been contributing to the beef production in a major way. Along with the breeders and producers and stocker operators, they've helped to double the productivity of the cattle business in less than 20 years. Quite a record. Cattlemen did it on their own, without help from anybody, and they're proud of it. In spite of their productivity, a lot of cattlemen are losing money today. It's not a new story. It's a cyclical business, and they know it. When it really comes down to it, they'll take their lumps and keep on raising beef because it's their way of life. They like the life, and they like the legend that goes with it. They have a proud past to honor and a future to build. Back in 1948, a cattleman named Dan Casement gave a speech to members of the American National Cattlemen's Association. Casement said this to those cattlemen: "You don't represent a business system or a political organization. You are a social class. You typify a way of life, a fraternity of ideals. You preserve the best in American lore, and you unify in a single code of citizenship the traditions of our forefathers of freedom, independence, opportunity, resourcefulness, and our rugged individuality." It was true when Dan Casement said it then, and it's just as true today. When you think about it, there's usually truth behind most legends. Cattlemen are a different breed, all right, and they like it that way.
If you enjoyed the Cattlemen and Cowboys special, it's available through the National Cattlemen's Foundation. Just head to nationalcattlemensfoundation.org. You'll find the link on the homepage. Proceeds from the sale of this special DVD directly benefit the work of the foundation. Thanks for watching this special edition of NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen. We'll return next week with another episode. In the meantime, check us out online at cattlementocattlemen.org.